Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Bridge Lunch Break event. My name is Jackie Garrett, Fund Development Associate at Bridge, Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news in Michigan. In this event, we'll take your questions about the Bridge team's recent electric vehicle road trip across Michigan. Our special guest panelists will include our entire road trip team, Bridge business reporter Paula Gardner, Bridge environment reporter Kelly House, and Bridge digital marketing associate Asha Lewis. Membership and engagement director Amber DeLind will moderate this discussion. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Amber will start the conversation with Paula, Kelly, and Asha with reader questions they received during the trip. And then we'll turn to your questions you submitted when you registered as well. And then also your questions that you submit during this event. So you'll have lots of opportunities to get those questions answered. Please type any questions you have for our panelists into the chat window at any time. If you're not a panelist, please remain muted through today's discussion. We are recording today's conversation and it will be posted on Bridge Michigan this week. You can subscribe to our newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and click subscribe. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join this membership community, we will drop a link to do so in the chat. A reminder, please stay muted throughout this conversation. And now I'll pass it over to Amber to get us started.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And thank you to all of the Bridge readers who probably followed along on the EV road trip. And we're so happy to see you here today and to answer some of your questions. So before I dive into the questions that you have, I just want to give our three road trippers a chance to sort of set the stage for what their adventure was like and what they embarked upon. So to get us started, Paula, could you tell us a little bit about sort of where the idea for this trip came from?
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer for you, and I wish we actually remembered. But it's a natural offshoot from both my beat and Kelly's beat. And I know probably going back at least to early 2022 when Michigan adopted the SOAR fund to fund the EV battery factories, and it became a big economic issue in Michigan. I talked with my editors at the time every now and then about we should rent an EV and we should do a little road trip. But the emphasis was on little, and somehow this just emerged into if we're going to do that, why don't we do this around Lake Michigan? I remember Kelly saying that at a meeting at one point because the state is trying to make that a tourist destination. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. Like, what would tourists do in Michigan in an EV, and where should they go? And all of a sudden, we were spending 4 nights on the road over 5 days.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. I can't wait. I know there are lots of questions about what you learned on the trip and what it was like. But before we get there, Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about how you decided where you were going and what sort of the map was going to be for the trip?
Yeah, so nearly 3 years ago, our governor made an announcement that Michigan was teaming up with its neighboring states to make like the greatest, electric vehicle road trip. And it was going to be a route around Lake Michigan where people could, basically travel and have a place to charge without range anxiety. We already knew that, there's an ambition there, but that we are not anywhere near sort of the number of chargers that the state has an ambition to get. So we wanted to know, what is it like to travel that route now? Is it possible to do that road trip in an EV? And specifically looking at an area where there had been some intentional effort to build out charging infrastructure.
Thanks. Asha, you may be a new face to some of the folks on today's lunch break. Asha is our digital marketing associate, and she does all sorts of things to help make sure that the audience of Bridge finds us and continues to grow. But she joined the trip and was sort of responsible for a lot of the visuals and the multimedia that went along with this trip. Asha, can you tell us a little bit about why it was so important to have those sort of multimedia aspects to help readers follow along with the road trip?
Yeah, so I'm new to driving an EV, even riding in an EV. So I wanted to show kind of what it's like to drive it for people and to actually see it, see the chargers, see us experiencing range anxiety as if they're there. And I think that's important because this is an experience that a lot of Michiganders don't have. And I think it's important to see it.
Very cool. Well, thank you, all three of you, and I'm so glad that you made it back safely. I'm excited now to just ask some of the questions that readers submitted, because there were dozens of questions submitted about sort of how this trip would work, what you learned, and how the logistics of the trip happened for you. So my first question is one that we got from a lot of readers, which was, why did you end up having a Chevy Bolt as your EV vehicle? I think there were some questions about, was that the best vehicle to use for the trip? Can you just, anyone can take this one. How did we end up with a Bolt?
Well, I was the initiator of it, but we were car agnostic. We did not want a Tesla because we knew there was an existing system for Tesla that would make the experience completely different. So I took over the car rental, and I did a fair amount of research. Not wanting a Tesla and wanting a vehicle that could hold three of us, I actually at one point kind of crossed the Bolt off our list, but it was also very difficult to choose a specific vehicle. And I was surprised too by the number of rental agencies that actually offered me the choice to select an EV, which has changed drastically over the past year as the rental agencies dropped their fleets and cut back dramatically. So I set it up that we would have kind of a mid-size SUV, and we just crossed our fingers. And I was kind of figuring out what a plan B would be if we got to the place and there wasn't a car available. And suddenly there was a national air emergency, and people were competing very hard for rental cars. The person ahead of me in line, in fact, was driving back to New Hampshire. So when they offered me a Bolt, I just nodded and said thank you. And then Kelly started to speak up about some of the things she was hearing from her sources that gave us a little bit more insight into the Bolt.
Yeah, we almost immediately, well, we had heard ahead of the trip, like anything but a Chevy Bolt, and then immediately when we, announced like, here's our car, here's where we're going, people were groaning, like, you're going to have a worse time because you're in this car. And the reason is the Chevy Bolt was super popular. It just went out of production in December, but it was popular because it was really affordable relative to other EVs. But the drawback is it's not great for road trips because newer models, when you're on a road trip, you're beholden to public chargers. And usually you're trying to get back on the road. So fast chargers are like a godsend, to be able to go to a charger, within 30 minutes, have a full battery and move on. Bolts do not have the ability to take in all of the electricity that a fast charger can give out as fast as other vehicles. So basically they take, 2 to 3 times longer at a fast charger than a lot of other models, which obviously if you're on a road trip, you don't necessarily want to be sitting there for an hour and a half waiting for your battery to get to 80% to get it back on the road. So, we would have had a different experience in a different car model. And that's something we sort of talked about and acknowledged as we were writing about this, that this is an experiment. And one of our variables is the model of car that we ended up with.
But I would think too, as somebody who's been writing about, fleet purchases and the sales of EVs and everything, it is a pretty typical experience of somebody who's offered the chance to lease an EV at a rental car station. You can't really choose your model in many cases, and it was one of the things offered.
I see. That makes sense. And that was a question that kind of covers a lot of the questions, but there were a lot of questions that we received from folks about the chargers themselves and the various types of chargers that exist. Can you explain to our readers a little bit about how you knew where to find a charger, a little bit about the apps that you use? I think there's a lot of apprehension coming from readers about even being able to navigate some of those systems.
Yeah, I can start on that. Again, we had some conversations with experienced EV owners heading into this, which I have to say, one of the pieces of advice that I got was never take a road trip, the moment you buy an EV, wait until you're familiar with the car. Obviously for renters, that's not feasible. But the other piece of advice was, you know, unlike a gas station where you can just kind of go anywhere, swipe your credit card and fuel up, many EV chargers have proprietary app-based payment systems. So you have to download the app, upload your payment info to the app, and then use that at the pump or at the plug. And if you're along certain rural parts of the Lake Michigan shoreline, you might not have cell phone service to download an app. So we were lucky in that we got the advice to download the most common apps ahead of time, probably 3 or 4. By the end of our trip, we had downloaded, I think I counted 6 proprietary apps, plus an app called Plug Share that is basically like Google Maps for finding plug points, public plug points. So yeah, it's a lot of preparation in a way that you're not doing that with a gas-powered road trip.
I did the reservations for our overnight stays too, and it entered into a lot of the decision making. And we ended up with a range of experiences that a normal traveler would find, including trying to stay at a state campground and having to switch the reservation to a site that actually had a stronger electrical current available. So, you know, I was trying to filter through Airbnb, look for hotels, then researching the hotel because a lot of them don't mention, do we have an EV charger or not? And finding basically the network of advice out there for what plugs work, you know, how you can count on them, the latest feedback from people who have actually used them. So that's how we learned, for example, that on our last night, the hotel that we stayed at would be very friendly about letting us just plug into an outside wall outlet. And that was the best we had, best option in that part of Michigan.
That is wild. This is sort of a policy focused question, but I wonder, I feel like it's one that we got from a few readers. Speaking of sort of the plugs and the levels, is there any talk about efforts to sort of standardize chargers in the future? Because it does seem like this piecemeal system is pretty untenable for continuing to get people to buy in.
Yeah, I'm not aware when it comes to sort of consolidating the apps. I'm not aware of any official standardization effort there. But when it comes to plugs, you know, different models of EVs have different plug mechanisms, which means, for instance, our Bolt had nowhere to charge when we were almost out of batteries near Sleeping Bear Dunes because the nearest charger was a Tesla charger and we didn't have an adapter to plug into that kind of plug. There is an ongoing standardization effort that probably will really ramp up in the next year. So Ford sort of started that off by announcing that it was going to make adapters available for its existing EVs to be able to plug into the Tesla model charger plug point. And in the next year or so, many manufacturers will just be making that plug style standard on their vehicles when they're manufactured. So we're getting there, but at this point, it still is kind of a juggling act to figure out where you can charge and what adapter you might need if you don't drive a vehicle that's already compatible with that charging style.
And I'll add that that's actually something that I want to research a little bit more now that I'm back. When I think about it, it makes me a little bit crazy thinking about all of the R&D that's been pushed into these vehicles and the fact that many makers seem to kind of go for their own good idea as opposed to kind of standardizing, sharing, licensing early on. Because I think that could have made a huge difference toward adoption, towards controlling costs, toward, you know, manufacturing efficiencies, just a whole range of production aspects that would have possibly positioned these for better experience in the market.
There's a question in the chat from Rich, which is also one that a few readers asked when they registered for the event. Through, you know, your use of the apps and your charging throughout, were you able to sort of create a cost comparison between what how much it costs to charge versus how much it might have to gas up in a similar trip, and what were the conclusions?
Yeah, we were, and I'll drop a story link in the chat where we offer up the raw numbers. But bottom line, it was significantly cheaper. It would have been even more significantly cheaper if we were in a situation to charge at home. So sort of the levels of refueling affordability for EVs are home charging, which there are tons of variables, but averages like as much as a third the price of gassing up. Level 2 public charging, which are the slower chargers that take longer to refuel, but also tend to be cheaper. And then fast chargers, which refuel really fast, but are often like pretty much the same price as the price of gas. So we used a mix of free and cheap level 2 chargers and then more expensive fast chargers. And in the end, we came out, I don't know, maybe $50 cheaper than it would have been in a gas powered car. When you talk about time being money, we spent a lot more time waiting for refueling.
Thank you. All right, let's see here. There were a couple questions about, different types of road trips. So of course, road trips often take place in the summer, especially in a beautiful state like Michigan. But there was a reader who said, that they are interested in doing a colder weather road trip, say around Thanksgiving, to go visit family. In your reporting, have you found that it suggests that colder weather impacts performance of the vehicles, and what would that look like in your estimation based on this trip to do this in a cold weather scenario?
Kelly, you might even know like the numbers, but yeah, definitely the charge will not last as long in a cold weather environment. And I don't even know like how fast the charge would bleed out. I actually heard a horror story the other day from someone who was relaying a Tesla owner's experience when it was below zero, and it involved multiple stops on the way home because they kept thinking that they had enough and they were losing so fast that they just had to keep stopping, even though they are a proud owner and an experienced driver.
Yeah, I don't think there's a specific, range is dependent upon a lot of factors, including how fast you're driving, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the rule of thumb is like in the neighborhood of 20% less range on a battery in sub-freezing temperatures if you're driving highway speeds.
We did have, I will say, we were talking when we were getting ready for the event. A few of us here in the office, as we were following along with your trip, we were saying, "Oh, that looks so fun. I would love to be part of that." And then we saw the Instagram video that Asha was making, talking to Kelly and Paula as you're having very severe range anxiety because of just figuring out the logistics of getting from one place to another. And there was a situation that you were in, and that was like, you weren't for sure whether you're going to make it to the next charger. We had a couple of questions. First was, did you have to take measures like turning the air off? And secondly, what does happen if you're out of gas? You just have to call a tow? Like what? Not gas, out of battery. Like what do you do?
Asha, you should take that one.
Yeah, so we did have to turn off the AC. And it's interesting too, because the car has like battery regeneration. So when you're coasting down a hill or you brake, there was a point before our range anxiety stretch where we were regenerating maybe 1 mile. We were kind of stuck in traffic. But when you're down to the wire like that, regeneration is not enough. So that was pretty scary. So yeah, we turned off the AC. I don't know if we really had any other actions other than kind of driving slow. There's a little gauge, and if you go above maybe 63, it'll tell you like you're in like a yellow zone where you're burning too much battery.
Yikes. My anxious heart feels nervous on all of your behalf. So part of your trip actually took you into Wisconsin, and we had one of our readers who registered for the event asked if there was a difference in charger availability between Michigan and Wisconsin, at least in the parts that you observed. And they wondered if it would have made sense for the Badger to offer charging during lake crossing.
You know, we were only in Wisconsin for what, 2 hours of driving time? So we did one recharge there. It was in Green Bay, which is a larger city, and we had no problem accessing chargers. I can't speak to the rest of the Lake Michigan shoreline in Wisconsin, where it's maybe a little more rural, because I would suspect it's similar to Michigan, that that's the area where chargers are fewest and farthest between. The question about the Badger is a great question, and I didn't think to ask people on the ship, you know, the folks who run the ship, if they're considering that at all. It does function like a tiny city that has to burn coal in order to power the ship. So in some ways, using that electricity to then recharge a vehicle, like, might nullify the environmental benefits of, you know, EV charging, but.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider our mood when we got off the Badger too, with that question. You know, when you start a trip, it's exciting, it's new. And we really kind of kept that flavor for all those days, because every day we were going somewhere else. And every night we were sleeping somewhere else in a different environment. And it just brought discovery at every step. Even getting on the Badger, I'd never dreamed that I was going to take the Badger with an EV and friends from work. And then we got off. And, you know, you start thinking, like, how fast can I get home? And this was a good trip, but it's time to wrap it up here. And, you know, sunset's coming and I want to get on the road. And we were faced with, how far can we go until we can get a good fast charge and only stop once? And that was just the driver at that moment. And if we had been able to come off that boat with a full charge, it probably would have been a game changer for our moods, and we might have made it home earlier.
Well, I was impressed by your enthusiasm, at least what came through your reporting, because when I get to that point of any road trip, I have decided that I'm ready to be home. So we did have a few questions from readers about kind of your advice for anyone who might be considering such a trip in an EV. So actually, this is kind of a sweet one. One of our readers asked, who or what provided the most help for you on your trip?
I can start. So as part of this trip, I reported a story about what we have dubbed EV evangelists. You know, there's this growing community in Michigan of people who have EVs and love them and have really made it their mission to sort of like hold other people's hands through the process of figuring out if an EV is right for them, and then figuring out how to be prepared to own one so that it doesn't become, you know, a bad experience. So I spent time talking with those folks for that story, and I also used it as an opportunity to get their advice. So Carl Bloss was one of those folks. I wrote about him in a story, and he also runs the Michigan EV, I'm going to mess up the name of it, but basically a Facebook group for Michigan EV enthusiasts. And I know, Paula, you also got some advice from someone who's got a lot of experience too, right?
Yeah, I wrote my newsletter about that today. It was Jim McGinnis from Crystal Mountain, who started his EV life with a Chevy Bolt, like, way back, and has brought a lot of sustainability initiatives to Crystal Mountain. He even let me drive his car, which was my first EV experience, about a month before we left. And just having kind of that foundational conversation was very helpful. I also ran into a friend at a graduation party a couple weeks ahead of that. So I felt like who works for an EV related company. So I couldn't use this person in my reporting, but just some of the tips that just started flowing during that conversation just set the foundation for me to even ask better questions of Jim when I finally had a chance to talk with him.
Yeah, we got a lot of good advice from readers, but at the same time, if you are thinking about buying EV and you don't know someone who can give you advice, I found a lot of really good comments on the PlugShare app. So we actually heard from a reader that all the fast chargers in downtown Traverse City were broken. And then I checked on PlugShare, and that the review said that too. So you don't know someone who is an EV evangelist, there are still like kind of online forums that will give you that information.
And it's like we were a part of a club every time we charged and there was somebody else there, which, it was like the whole spectrum. Sometimes we were alone the entire time, pulled out, there's left nobody. And sometimes there was actually kind of a crowd and people were willing to talk and help and just kind of share their stories anytime we initiated or they even tried to talk to us.
That's very cool. Speaking of PlugShare, there was a question here from a reader. They said, after making use of apps like PlugShare, are there any changes you'd make, that you'd recommend for anyone who is a new driver of an EV or a road tripper? Are there, basically, what would be your best advice as far as tools that someone might need, or just any, if someone's planning a trip like this, where would you tell them to make sure that they look, or what they should have on their phone, et cetera?
We didn't make use of this app, but it was recommended to me by people. Part of the reason is we were just so on the go and our schedule was dependent upon meeting other people and things like that. It just wasn't, planning looked different than it probably does for like a family road trip. But someone recommended to me this app called A Better Route Planner, which I think would have been really helpful to us on the day that we encountered range anxiety, because it not only tells you where chargers are available, but you can sort of plug in, okay, we're starting from Lansing and we have, 150 miles left on our battery. Our end destination today is Manistee. Where do we need to charge along the way to minimize our time at a charger and like maximize our battery? So it doesn't just tell you where chargers are, it tells you how long you need to be there and where to charge. I would love to explore that app in the future if I was ever just like renting an EV for my own road trip use.
I would love to see some of the things kind of dumbed down for people like me on the road too. I felt like every time I had to see, is this charger something that will work for us? You have like a little image of the plug, or you have the code of what kind of a plug it is, or I think at one point there were 2 different codes, but it was the same thing. And I'm not an electrical engineer. If I could have plugged in Chevy Bolt, looks like it's a 23, is this going to work? And just found the ones that would work, and just kind of like the streamlining thing that doesn't make you go through a bunch of filters to figure out the mechanics. We all know a gas pump is going to fit into your car. Something that makes it that simple.
I have just a couple of more questions to ask, but if there are anyone on the call who has questions for our panelists, please feel free to jot them down into the chat and we'll make sure that we ask them. Let's see here. One reader wanted to know, now that you're home, how will you continue to use what you learned on the trip to inform reporting and sort of the way we interact with readers?
I feel like I gained a real glimpse into the decisions people are making toward the sales figures that I end up seeing. And I'd mentioned the rental fleets earlier. I understand now why, say, Hertz, dumped a ton onto the market, and why I always saw Polestars in the lot, a year ago when I was renting a car. So there's that.
I think for me, it just gave me I've been writing about the lack of charger availability in Michigan for the past several months. And it gave me an on-the-ground understanding of the implications of that. It also gave me story ideas for the future, around where, not just how many chargers, but where we put them and who has access and what it means for, other goals that are tied to the build out of EVs, and including like who benefit from the reduction in, fumes and health hazards from that. And that all relates to who is able to purchase EVs and who is able to have infrastructure that makes owning one possible. So yeah, I would say it was enlightening on a lot of those fronts too.
Mhm.
I think I've got probably, go ahead, Paula, I'm sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, like, I was also like really grateful and surprised by all of the reader comments and how people wanted to know more, but also tell their own stories. And I feel like in some of what I do, like with the economic aspects of it, I'm looking for some more connections to pull people in. I'm not exactly sure what that answer is, but it's clear that people are interested in EVs, but in a very personal way. Like, what would it be like for me? And here's how it's been like, how it has been for me. So I think there's opportunity for me there somewhere.
Speaking of sort of people and personal, I mean, I know that you all met up with some readers, well, like had a sort of impromptu engagement event in a community while you were out and about. You got to see some really cool roadside attractions and some of the best of Michigan. Maybe take in a minute or so to just run us down some of your favorite experiences from the trip that weren't necessarily focused on the EVs itself.
I can start because I've never been here before. Kitchity Kippy in the UP was really beautiful, especially for a photographer. That was an awesome experience. And it was cool to kind of see these 4-year-olds basically pull us in this little raft across this gorgeous lake where you can see the water bubbling up from the bottom. I mean, that was an awesome experience. And it was a great day because we were in the UP, which is supposedly a charger desert, but we had a full battery because we were able to charge at the place we stayed at the night before. So a time when we were supposed to have this range anxiety, we didn't have it. And we got to see this awesome roadside attraction. So that was a fun experience.
I would say, like, there were so many, just a couple. Our first stop was in Zealand, where there was massive road construction. And over my entire career, massive road construction yields business anxiety, right? And we walk into this restaurant. Turns out it's been there for 100 years. They're super friendly. There's a story to tell, and Kelly jumps right on it. We loved having our lunch there, which might have been pre-dinner. And like nobody was upset about the road work either. You know, it was like we got this glimpse of Michigan that was different for us. It was this kind of the small town feel, and it was just different all the way around. And it set like a really, really good tone for the rest of the trip. I also enjoyed having dinner at the lake in Muskegon. Muskegon is one of the cities in Michigan that is most alien to me, I guess. I've spent very little time there, and watching people enjoy the lakeshore there, I thought was really cool.
I struggled to pick. I mean, it was all, what a privilege to be able to do your job. I mean, we worked hard on this trip, don't get me wrong, but like do your job and also get to just experience the wonder and beauty of our state and the people who are playing key roles in their community. I guess if I have to choose, and I'll choose something different than what was already chosen, I loved the Snowmobile Museum because I grew up in northern Michigan, so snowmobiles are, sort of have that mystique to me. And the people who run it are just so lovely and enthusiastic about what they do. And I always get excited when I get to talk to people who are like super into whatever it is they're passionate about.
That's very cool. We've got one last reader question here from the chat, and then I'll toss it to Jackie to close us out for the afternoon. Heather asked about, there's a lot of decisions that government officials at all levels are having to make when it comes to sort of supporting, the global transition to EVs. What's your sense as you're talking to folks and you're reporting about, how much experience and knowledge those folks have or get to have about how these things work when they're making, policy decisions about infrastructure that support it? And is there anything that can be done to sort of help them better have a grasp of it?
I think there are a lot of people out there like us who are complete novices and know them only in a theoretical way. But what I also feel now more acutely is people are doing an economic analysis and they're comparing it to a regular car. And if it doesn't compare well, they walk away. And I heard a story yesterday about a municipal official in mid-Michigan doing just that, when I believe it was the federal government reached out and tried to offer a discount on EV purchases for the community, and the math didn't work. And I just think that that's out there.
All right. Well, this has been a really cool conversation after an amazing adventure that I was so eager to follow along on, and I'm excited to see what reporting comes from it next. But with that, I'm going to kick it over back to my colleague Jackie to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Amber. And thanks to Paula and Kelly and Asha for participating here, and just sharing, their experience on the EV road trip. I'll give a reminder to all of our listeners here that we'll be posting a recording of today's program on Bridge Michigan's website, app, and social media channels this week. And we will have a post-primary election lunch break that will be announced very soon. So again, thank you to all of our listeners, and everybody have a wonderful day.